The oak-paneled courtroom smelled of old paper, leather and dust polished with lemon oil. High above the crowd, the American flag hung behind the raised mahogany bench, flanked by heavy golden curtains. The chandeliers glimmered faintly as though even they were holding their breath. It was a day New York City would not soon forget. The people in attendance, lawyers, reporters, camera crews, and ordinary citizens crammed into every available bench, sat restless, waiting for the sentencing to begin. Everyone had come to witness a 14-year-old black boy, Marcus Taylor, stand before one of the strictest judges in the state, Judge Samuel Harrison. Harrison was a man whose reputation stretched across courthouses like a shadow. Tall, gaunt, with icy blue eyes, he had earned the nickname the Executioner among defense attorneys. He was known for handing down the harshest possible sentences, even to young offenders. To him, the law was iron, unbending, and absolute. Marcus sat quietly at the defendant's table, his hands folded tightly on the polished wood surface. His skin was smooth, his face young, but his eyes carried something far heavier than his years. He was dressed in a plain white shirt too big for his thin frame, a tie borrowed from his mother's co-worker, and dark trousers that wrinkled around his sneakers. Behind him, his mother, Angela Taylor, sat in the gallery. Her nurse's uniform peeked out beneath. Her jacket, she had come directly from the hospital after an overnight shift. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep and tears. Her lips pressed together in silent prayer. The court clerk called for silence. The bailiff's voice boomed, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Samuel Harrison." The crowd stood. Judge Harrison entered with his usual brisk pace, robes flowing behind him like a dark tide. He took his seat and scanned the courtroom. When his eyes landed on Marcus, there was no warmth, only calculation. "Be seated," the judge said firmly. The scrape of chairs echoed as the crowd obeyed. The prosecutor, a sharp-suited man named Richard Klein, rose immediately. He was ambitious, hungry for a win, and the cameras were his audience. "Your Honor," Klein began, "the case before us is not simply about petty theft. It is about a pattern of behavior, a dangerous trajectory we must address before this young man becomes a true menace to society." Marcus stared down at the table, jaw tight. Klein gestured toward him dramatically. "Caught near the scene of an armed robbery, resisting questioning by officers, with a history of behavioral issues at school. Marcus Taylor represents exactly the kind of juvenile offender our system cannot afford to be lenient with." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. The prosecution's voice rang like a sermon. "The people demand accountability. The people demand justice." Judge Harrison leaned forward. And the defense. Marcus's public defender, a tired man named Daniel Ruiz, stood. He wasn't the city's best attorney, overworked, underpaid, but he had grown fond of Marcus. "Your Honor," Ruiz began carefully, "what the prosecution describes as a menace is in fact a 14-year-old boy with no prior record. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. There is no evidence linking him directly to the robbery. This is a child who needs guidance, not punishment." The judge's lips tightened. He disliked speeches about guidance. To him, leniency was weakness. But before he could respond, something unexpected happened. Marcus raised his head. His dark eyes, glistening with defiance, locked on the judge. Slowly, deliberately, he stood up. His small hands trembled, but his voice was steady. "Your Honor," Marcus said loudly, interrupting the court. The entire courtroom froze. The judge's gavel slammed. "You will sit down this instant, young man. You do not speak without permission." But Marcus didn't sit. His voice cut through the air like a blade. "2 words, just 2." And Judge Harrison's pale face drained of color. The bailiff shifted nervously. The prosecutor blinked in shock, and whispers erupted in the gallery. Angela's hand flew to her mouth as though she already understood. Judge Harrison's lips parted, but no sound came out. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the bench, eyes flicking rapidly from Marcus to the crowd, then back again. The room had transformed. It was no longer just a trial of a boy accused of robbery. Something deeper, darker had just surfaced. "Order in the court," the bailiff shouted, but it was useless. Reporters leaned forward, cameras clicked, and every single person wanted to know the same thing. What were those 2 words? The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Judge Harrison swallowed hard, his face ashen, sweat forming along his temple. For the first time in his decades on the bench, he looked afraid. And Marcus, standing tall despite his age, did not break eye contact. The words he had spoken would unravel secrets buried for years. Secrets the judge had thought were locked away forever. The trial had just taken a turn no one could have predicted. And it all began with a black boy daring to speak when no one else would. The sound of the gavel still echoed in Jamal's mind as he stepped out of the courthouse that afternoon. The winter air of Brooklyn bit sharply against his cheeks, carrying with it the mingled scents of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor and exhaust fumes from Yellow, cabs honking impatiently on Court Street. For a boy who had just shaken an entire courtroom into silence with only 2 words, the world outside seemed unnervingly normal. He pulled his hoodie tighter, slipping into the moving crowd. People brushed past him, businessmen with coffee in hand, mothers tugging toddlers, teenagers blasting music from cheap speakers. Life moved on, but Jamal carried a storm inside him. Behind him, the courthouse loomed like a gray fortress, its stone pillars watching him with silent judgment. He knew he couldn't go home yet. Not to that cramped apartment in Brownsville, where his mother worked double shifts, just to keep the lights on. Something had changed in that courtroom, and deep down, Jamal sensed it was only the beginning. The corners. The streets of Brooklyn were alive in their own dangerous way. Murals of fallen friends painted on brick walls, sneakers hanging from telephone wires, the laughter of kids masking the quiet threat of sirens in the distance. Jamal walked past the bodega on the corner of Fulton Street, where Mr. Rodriguez always gave him free gum. The bell above the door jingled as another boy his age. Malik stepped out with a soda in his hand. "Yo, Jamal." Malik grinned, but then his eyes narrowed. "Heard what you did in court today." Words traveling fast. Jamal froze. "Already? Man, you think people ain't gonna talk? Judge nearly fainted, right?" Malik's laugh was half mocking, half impressed. "Careful, bro. Folks don't forget when you embarrass power like that." Jamal shoved his hands into his hoodie pocket. He didn't want to talk about it, not here. Not on the street where whispers could turn into knives. The Watchers. What Jamal didn't know was that someone else had noticed him too. Across the street, leaning against a sleek black car, stood a man in a tailored coat. He was tall, with sharp eyes that followed Jamal's every move. His presence was out of place in this neighborhood. Too clean, too polished. The man pulled out his phone. "Yeah, it's him," he muttered into the receiver. "The boy. Keep an eye on him. No mistakes." Jamal didn't notice. He kept walking, his sneakers scraping against the cracked pavement. But the streets were never just streets in Brooklyn. They were veins carrying stories, secrets, and sometimes traps. Turning down a narrow alley shortcut, Jamal heard a voice. "Kid!" He froze. Shadows stretched across graffiti-stained walls. A figure stepped forward. An older man with a beard, his coat tattered. His eyes sharp with the kind of knowledge only hard years could carve into a soul. "You don't know what you've started," the man rasped. Jamal's stomach tightened. "Who are you?" The stranger smiled faintly. "Someone who's seen too many boys like you get swallowed by this city. Listen, those words you spoke in court? They weren't just words. They were a spark. And sparks in Brooklyn either light fires or burn you alive." Jamal's heart thudded. The man's warning felt heavier than any sentence a judge could deliver. Suddenly, the roar of an engine broke the air. The sleek black car from earlier rolled slowly past the alley. Jamal felt eyes drilling into him from behind tinted glass. The bearded stranger's expression hardened. "Go, kid, now!" Without thinking, Jamal bolted, sneakers pounding against pavement. He weaved through crowds, his breath ragged. He didn't know who those men were or why they were watching him, but instinct screamed danger. The city became a blur, subway entrances, flashing neon signs, steam rising from grates. Somewhere behind him, he thought he heard footsteps. He didn't stop until he reached the basketball court near his block. The chain-link fence rattling as he leaned against it, gasping for air. Brooklyn nights. As darkness fell, streetlights flickered on, casting orange pools of light onto cracked sidewalks. Jamal sat on a bench, staring at the graffiti-covered court. His thoughts spiraled. Why was he being watched? What was it about those 2 words in the courtroom that scared grown men in suits? The sound of laughter drew him back. A group of older teens approached, their swagger carrying the weight of territory. Jamal recognized them, the kind of boys who ruled corners, the kind his mother warned him to avoid. "Yo, ain't you the kid from court today?" one of them asked, stepping closer. Jamal hesitated. Lying wouldn't help. "Yeah." The leader smirked. "Respect. Took guts to say that in front of a judge. But guts don't keep you safe out here." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You got people watching you now. Big people. If you're smart, you'll stick with us. We look out for our own." Jamal felt the trap in the offer. Loyalty on the streets always came at a cost. By the time Jamal returned home, his mother was already asleep on the couch. Still in her work uniform, exhaustion etched into her face. He stood quietly, guilt tugging at him. She had sacrificed everything to give him a chance. And now he was tangled in something he couldn't explain. Looking out the cracked window at the city skyline, Jamal realized Brooklyn wasn't just his home. It was his battlefield. The streets whispered choices: surrender to the system, fall into the gangs, or fight for something bigger, even if he didn't yet understand what that was. As sirens wailed in the distance, Jamal whispered to himself, "I'm not going to be swallowed by this city." But somewhere in the shadows, men in black coats and polished shoes were already closing in. The courtroom had shifted from a place of law to a place of suspense. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked outside the heavy wooden doors, and whispers filled every corner of the gallery like a growing storm. Judge Whitmore sat stiffly, his hands folded on the bench. He had ruled over hundreds of trials, but never had one veered so violently off script. A child appearing from nowhere, pointing a trembling finger at the very man sworn to deliver justice. It was unthinkable. Yet, as he studied the prosecutor's face, he felt something gnaw at his instincts. ADA Michael Kerrigan, usually composed and deliberate, looked shaken. He kept pacing, his polished shoes tapping too quickly against the floor. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted between the boy and the judge, never quite settling. Graves, the defendant, had leaned back in his chair, silent now, but there was no smugness in his expression, only exhaustion, as if he had carried the weight of this secret for too long. The boy, Daniel, stood alone at the center of it all. He had not been called, he had not been sworn in, and yet every pair of eyes was on him. His voice had shifted the course of the trial, like a stone dropped into still water. "Your Honor," Kerrigan barked finally, his voice louder than it needed to be, "I object to this circus. This boy's presence is not only irregular, it's unlawful. He is not a witness. He is not sworn in. This is hearsay, nothing more. I demand that he be removed and this disruption stricken from the record." But Judge Whitmore did not gavel him down. He leaned forward, his eyes steady. "Mr. Kerrigan," he said slowly, "the boy made a claim that cannot be ignored. The integrity of this court requires that even irregularities be considered, especially when they strike at the very heart of justice." The gallery erupted again. Gasps, whispers, the shifting of restless bodies. Kerrigan's face flushed. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is an insult to the justice system. We cannot allow a frightened child to derail months of preparation. Evidence and testimony." "Evidence?" Graves' voice cracked through the tension, hoarse but clear. He rose halfway from his seat, ignoring the tug of his attorney's hand. "You mean the evidence you planted?" The courtroom froze. Kerrigan's face went pale. "That is a lie, and I will not—" "It's not a lie," Daniel interrupted, his small voice cutting through like a blade. He turned toward the jury, his chest rising and falling quickly. "I saw him." That night. Whitmore's sharp gaze pinned the boy. "Daniel, are you saying you were present at the scene of the alleged murder?" Daniel nodded. His hands trembled, but his eyes held steady. "I wasn't supposed to be there, but I saw him, and I saw the man who died. He tried to run, but—" His voice broke, his lips trembling as he searched for the words. "He didn't make it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth with her hand. Whitmore's gavel came down once, not to silence, but to steady the chaos. "This changes the scope of these proceedings," he said gravely. "We are no longer dealing with a simple fraud case. The boy has linked the prosecution itself to a potential act of murder. That cannot be brushed aside." Kerrigan slammed his hand on the table. "This is absurd." Your Honor, I will not stand here and have my name dragged through the mud by a child. He has no proof. Proof? Graves spat the word like venom. You want proof? Open your files. Check the dates. The numbers don't match because they were never supposed to. You think I didn't know you were setting me up? I stayed quiet because I was scared. Scared of exactly this moment. The gallery stirred again, the atmosphere thick with disbelief and fear. Whitmore turned to the bailiff. Take the boy to chambers for protection, and secure him. No one is to approach him until I order it. The bailiff nodded, moving to escort Daniel. The boy's eyes flickered nervously toward Kerrigan, who stood frozen, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. As Daniel was led out, his voice echoed back over his shoulder. He isn't what he pretends to be. He was there. I swear it. The heavy doors closed behind him, and the silence he left was crushing. Whitmore looked over the courtroom, his voice low but firm. We will recess until further notice. This trial is no longer proceeding under ordinary circumstances. Mr. Kerrigan, you will remain available for questioning. Kerrigan's jaw tightened. His eyes flickered with something sharp, fear, rage, perhaps both, but he forced himself to nod. The gavel struck. All rise. The courtroom exploded into noise, reporters rushing toward the doors, lawyers whispering furiously, jurors pale and shaken. Graves sat back down heavily, his lawyer whispering urgently into his ear, but his eyes never left Kerrigan. And Kerrigan, though he stood tall, could feel it. The cracks forming in the case he had built, the shadows closing in. Because the boy hadn't just whispered the truth. He had lit a fuse. The judge's gavel had silenced the courtroom. But the echoes of Daniel's words refused to fade, even outside the chamber. As reporters rushed to telephones and cameras blinked in anticipation, the boy's trembling accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Daniel sat in a small conference room just off the judge's chambers. His legs dangled from the edge of a leather chair, not quite reaching the floor. The bailiff stood by the door, arms crossed, a silent guardian. Across from the boy, Judge Whitmore sat with his spectacles low on his nose, studying him carefully. For the first time that day, Daniel looked small, just a child again. His bravado from the courtroom had drained away, replaced by the quiet shiver of someone carrying too heavy a burden. Whitmore's voice softened. Daniel, I need you to be honest with me. Do you understand what happens when you make accusations like the ones you made in there? Daniel nodded slowly. His eyes flicked downward, tracing the grooves in the wooden table. I know. Then tell me the truth, Whitmore pressed gently. How do you know Michael Kerrigan? How do you know about that night? For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. His small fists clenched in his lap, and his lips trembled. Then, in a voice no louder than a whisper, he began. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was hiding. Whitmore's brow furrowed. Hiding where? Daniel lifted his gaze, his eyes dark and wet. In the warehouse. The one near the river. The judge's heart skipped. That was the same warehouse the prosecution had cited in its evidence. The place where documents had supposedly been destroyed, the place linked to the fraud charges, Daniel continued. Words tumbling out now faster, as if holding them back would crush him. My mom, she used to clean offices. That night she brought me with her because she didn't want me alone. She told me to stay in the corner, to be quiet. But then men came. They weren't supposed to. She hid me behind some crates. His breath hitched, and he wiped at his eyes. I saw them. Mr. Kerrigan was there. He was talking to another man. They were angry, shouting. The other man said he had proof, papers, recordings. He said he would take it to the police. Whitmore leaned forward. His hands trembled slightly, though he kept his voice calm. And then what happened, Daniel? The boy's face went pale. He swallowed hard, his voice breaking. They fought. The man tried to run. He almost made it to the door. But Kerrigan grabbed something heavy. He hit him. The man fell, and he didn't get up again. The room fell into silence. Even the bailiff, hardened by years of service, shifted uneasily, his eyes narrowing. Daniel's hands twisted in his lap. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my mom, she covered my mouth. She told me to stay quiet or they would find me too. She kept me hidden until they were gone. And your mother? Whitmore asked carefully. Daniel shook his head, tears spilling now. She's gone. She tried to tell someone later, but she disappeared. I haven't seen her since that night. The judge sat back, the weight of the confession pressing down on his chest. If the boy was telling the truth, then this was not just fraud, not just corruption. This was murder, covered and buried by one of the very men sworn to uphold the law. Whitmore took off his glasses, rubbing his forehead. Daniel, why didn't you come forward sooner? Daniel's voice was barely audible. Because I was scared. I thought nobody would believe me. But when I saw Mr. Graves on the news, when they said he did it, I couldn't stay quiet anymore. It wasn't fair. He didn't kill that man. I know who did. The silence in the room was suffocating. Finally, the judge spoke. Daniel, what you've said today will change everything, but it will also put you in great danger. You understand that? Daniel nodded, though his lips trembled. I'm already in danger, aren't I? The judge's chest tightened. This child had been forced into a world of fear and secrets no child should ever know. At that moment, the door creaked open. The bailiff stiffened as Graves's defense attorney entered, his face pale and drawn. Your Honor, the press is tearing this place apart. Reporters are demanding answers. And Kerrigan? He hesitated, glancing at the boy. Kerrigan is furious. He's calling this a stunt. He wants the boy arrested for perjury. Whitmore's jaw hardened. That will not happen. Not while I sit on this bench. He rose, looking at Daniel with something almost paternal in his eyes. I will protect you, son. But from this moment forward, your life will not be the same. Do you understand? Daniel met his gaze, his small shoulders squared with fragile determination. I don't care. I just want the truth to come out. Outside, the roar of reporters grew louder, like waves crashing against the courthouse steps. And inside, Judge Whitmore knew the truth. The trial had slipped beyond his control. This was no longer just a case. This was a war. The next morning, the courthouse was surrounded by chaos. News vans lined the street, their antennas reaching skyward like iron trees. Protesters and onlookers filled the steps, shouting, holding signs, demanding justice. Inside, the air was electric, every bench packed, every juror wide-eyed, reporters scribbling like mad. Judge Whitmore entered with an expression carved from stone. He knew the world was watching. His black robe felt heavier than ever as he raised his gavel. Court is now in session. All eyes shifted to the prosecution table. Michael Kerrigan sat there, his jaw tight, his usually immaculate suit rumpled at the collar. His eyes burned, but not with confidence, with desperation. Across from him, Leonard Graves sat with his lawyer, quiet, watching. And in the front row, under the watchful protection of two bailiffs, sat Daniel. His small figure was dwarfed by the towering walls of justice, but his presence was undeniable. He had become the center of this storm. The judge wasted no time. Yesterday, serious accusations were made in this courtroom. Mr. Kerrigan, as the prosecuting attorney, you have been implicated in events surrounding not only this fraud case, but also the death of a whistleblower. You will address this court. Kerrigan rose, his fists clenched. Your Honor, this is madness. You're going to take the word of a child, over the years of work and evidence presented by this office, over a spotless record of service to the people of this city? His voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear beneath his anger. Graves's lawyer stood calmly. Your Honor, the boy's testimony is consistent with facts your court already knows. The warehouse, the missing documents, the unexplained death. Everything lines up. And if you check phone records, security footage, and financial transfers, you will find the connections lead directly to Mr. Kerrigan. Gasps rippled across the room. Kerrigan slammed his hand against the table. This is slander. I am the law in this courtroom! Without me, there is no justice. Judge Whitmore's eyes hardened. No, Mr. Kerrigan, justice does not serve men. Justice serves truth. The gallery erupted in murmurs of approval. Reporters scribbled furiously. Daniel stood, his small voice trembling but strong. I saw you. I'll never forget your face. You killed him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Kerrigan's face twisted, not into outrage but into something darker. His mask cracked wide open. His voice dropped to a low, venomous growl. You should have stayed hidden, boy. The courtroom gasped. Bailiffs surged forward as Kerrigan lunged, but he was restrained within seconds, his outburst sealing his fate. Judge Whitmore's gavel thundered like a cannon. Enough, Michael Kerrigan. By the testimony presented and by your own admission through conduct, you are hereby placed under arrest on charges of obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and murder. The room exploded, shouts, gasps, cameras flashing like lightning. Kerrigan struggled against the bailiffs, his voice hoarse with rage. You'll regret this, all of you. You think you know the truth, but you don't know anything. But his words were drowned out by the roar of the crowd as he was dragged from the courtroom, shackled and defeated. Graves slumped forward, his face in his hands. For the first time in months, the shadow of accusation lifted. His lawyer squeezed his shoulder, whispering, It's over. Judge Whitmore turned to Daniel, his stern features softening. Son, you have shown courage today that many grown men could never summon. Because of you, justice has found its way through lies and corruption. This court owes you a debt that cannot be measured. Daniel blinked back tears, his voice no louder than a whisper. I just wanted the truth. The judge nodded. And you gave it to us. He lifted his gavel one final time. This case is closed. The wood struck with finality, echoing like thunder across the oak-paneled room. Outside, as Daniel stepped into the sunlight surrounded by reporters and flashing cameras, he felt something strange. Not safety, not yet. But for the first time since that terrible night, he felt lighter. He had spoken. He had been heard. And though the world still seemed vast and dangerous, Daniel knew one thing with certainty. The silence was broken. Justice had spoken,